honored to welcome you here to the Great Hall tonight as we reflect on this historic tragedy and its lasting impact. A little over 102 years ago, Clara Lemlich rose to this very stage to call her fellow garment workers to a general strike. They were mostly young immigrant women who, by the thousands, amassed here in the Great Hall to get organized. Inspired by their solidarity, they left here together and endured a strike that lasted through the bitter winter months. Their bold actions eventually resulted in union contracts for some, but not for all, and not for the Triangle workers. Though the owners of the Triangle made some concessions to get the girls back to work, the failure of the garment workers to obtain bargaining rights would prove fatal a year later. Their outcry against unsafe conditions in their factory went largely ignored. As we remember the Triangle Fire, we recount the extraordinary achievements of those who were moved by this preventable disaster and fought for real change, devoting their lives to a labor movement that would later inspire the New Deal, give rise to the Department of Labor, and draft much of the labor legislation that we consider commonplace today. Even now, with laws and regulations, there is still much to be fought and won. Let us take a moment to consider recent avoidable disasters, such as the explosion last year that killed 29 miners in West Virginia. The Upper Big Branch mine, owned and operated by the anti-union Massey Energy Company, had been cited countless times for health and safety violations before the explosion. Let us also consider the meatpacking industry, once widely unionized decades ago, now reduced to sweatshop conditions. The practices of a few of the largest meatpacking companies keeping two sets of injury records, one for themselves and one for the U.S. Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Right now, the Department of Labor reports that nearly 30% of workers in this industry suffer illness and injury, in contrast to the 10% of workers in other manufacturing jobs. Many of them are immigrants. I am reminded of a quotation by the great labor leader, Mary Harris Jones, known as Mother Jones, who said, quote, "Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. Thank you and welcome."
I mean, 100 years later, why are people jamming in the doors to hear a program about the Triangle Fire? As was just mentioned, there's something enduring in this story. Maybe something has to do with the way society 100 years ago treated young people and the way it treats young people today. Something about the way it treated women. Something about the way it treats women today. Something about the way 100 years ago immigrants were so disposable and the way they're so disposable today. And here we are at a moment where it seems to me that the fire that consumed those 146 lives are still burning. I walked by, on my way over here, I walked by the site. It's not far from here where those workers perished. And I heard someone speaking to the crowd saying, well, you know, it was a tragedy of miscommunication. And I saw somebody interject from the crowd and said, no, no, no. It was a tragedy of profit. Those are the fires that are still burning. The fire of profit. The fires of arrogance and greed. And we just happened to be gathering here at a moment where those fires threaten to consume us all. And I think that's why you're here tonight. And that's why we feel this issue so urgently. If you read the newspapers, they would have you believe that it's not the banks. It's not the speculators or Goldman Sachs who threw you out of your home or threw you off your job. It's the unions. It's those greedy public sector workers. See, I'm a teacher and a union member, the worst of the worst.
Tonight we're here to witness, to remember March 25th, 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. The women and men who died gave us a gift that they didn't suspect. Our lives are changed because of that. And like all stories, they begin with the literal. The conditions of the Ash building. It was occupied, it was built and occupied in 1901. By 1911, it had been around for 10 years because it was 10,000 feet on each floor. Imagine, there were 500 workers, 10,000 feet on each floor. It was required, maybe just suggested, that it have 3 stairways. But the builders said, no, it's all right, we have 2 and they're far apart. And the other thing was, there were no fire drills. A factory with 500 people and a fire, where will they go and how will they know how to go out in an orderly way? Let me read you something that was Section 80 in 1911. The state labor law required that factory doors, quote, shall be so constructed as to open outwardly where practicable and and shall not be locked, bolted, or fastened during working hours. The women and men lived, worked in a place that was crowded. They themselves had to sit and work in benches that had no exits. Huge benches with the machines in them that had no exits. They were very cumbersome and difficult to get around. They were not easily, you could not easily get up and move. Fire started on the 8th floor. It started on the 8th floor in the cutter's bin. The bins were loaded. The fire started in one of those cutter's bins. No one knows how or why. One of the women on the 8th floor said, oh, I smell smoke. I smell smoke. They looked around. She said, oh, look, fire coming right out from the cutter's benches. I mean, great big long tables. They weren't benches, tables. And there was fire coming out. Well, cutters all got water, and they buckets of water. But you see, what happened was they used to put the patterns on hooks above their heads that were right along the line. Now, all of a sudden, the flames were so high, it picked up the patterns. They were now floating all over. They were little thin papers. They floated on the lawn. That fabric, that lawn, was so volatile. It was actually worse than paper. So immediately it caught. Things were happening fast. A young man came in with more water. They tried to get a hose. They tried to get it out. No go. When the women went and they saw the fire and they started jumping up, remember, no fire drills, nothing. They went to the door and they went to the Washington Place door to open it. It was locked. They couldn't get out. When the production manager came to try to help them, the door, because they wanted more space in the factory for more machines, etc., did not go out. It went in. The women who were pushing and the men who were pushing forward to get out the door closed the door. There was no exit there. It was not a good way of getting out. Others had gone to the Green Street exit. Now that exit was easier, was closer to them. Rose Gulo went out that way. She was the floor lady. She had said, okay, we're going to get down. They tried to get down, but within minutes, the flames were so high that it was practically impossible to get through it. The air, the smoke, and it was in minutes. Everything was burning. The trim, the wood trim around the windows, women started going to the windows themselves, trying to get air, trying to get out, and everybody said, we'll be here because the firemen will come up. They will come get us. The ladders will come. When the fire chief came, they put up the ladders, and it didn't go far enough. Inside, when the manager with the hoses, nothing worked. The flames, the smoke were so tremendous they couldn't breathe or even move further. They waited for the elevator. They went up and down, Gasper and Josillo, and they went up and down 8 or 9 times. The 10th floor was able to get out because one of the staircases went to the roof. And the people there had the advantage of going up to the roof. When the 8th floor caught like that, the 9th floor didn't know because no one had sent the message to the 9th floor. It happened that the switchboard operator was sick that day. The 9th floor had a terrible thing happen. They didn't know where to go because their Washington Place door was also locked. They went to the fire escape, and they were able to get out, but then there were so many of them on that fire escape. And the fire escape was not easy to get down. A young man who had been running down the stair, he saw his chance when he saw that the 6th floor had a window. He broke it, went in, and when his one foot was in the door and the other on the fire escape, he looked above and the whole fire escape fell with all the women down. The professor and his students at NYU helped get ladders on the 10th floor to help them. But who was going to help the people who were left on the 9th floor? The women who had nowhere to go. There was no fire escape. You're going to hear what happened at the windows. The fire escape was no good. One door was locked, and it remained locked, by the way. No one could open it, that particular one. They had only the elevators, and they went up and down with those 2 brave guys who were elevator operators until they couldn't anymore. The fire was so tremendous behind them that the women standing at the elevator shafts stood there. What were they to do? A few actually jumped for cables. One said, my 3 children, I couldn't not do something. She went on the top of a cable. Another one slid down, and they moved aside. One of them was riding down when the firemen were there trying to help. They had put hoses and were watering it at this point, but it was almost over. The whole thing was over in less than half an hour. The woman on the elevator top who had gotten down with holding the cable, these were open nets in the elevators, she saw a fireman. He said, keep going, you're all right. And she said, look. But she said later, I couldn't explain to him that all the women above were on fire and about to fall into the elevator.
Toll my little darling child. So this song was a response to the fire, directly published very, very soon after the Triangle Fire. But it had already existed as a theatrical song, a very heart-rending song about orphans who had no mother. And the last verse, which is what we performed, is the one that was added as an elegy to the Triangle Fire, to a pre-existing song. So that became about not the orphan without the mother, but the mother who had lost her child. So this is Mom and You. It's full of grief. It's a tremendously moving song. The next song that we're going to perform, Die Fire Corbunis, is something that had been, as far as we can tell, just about forgotten. And we're very fortunate that one of the members of the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition brought it to our attention. Andy Sosin was doing research and saw on the Library of Congress website the cover art for this and said to me, oh, you know, we've just met your band through the uprising of the 20,000 centenary, and what about this song? And I thought, oh, well, I haven't heard of it, but I'm sure, you know, some of the archivists I know, and no, it turned out none of them had heard of it before. Die Fire Corbunis, the title is what I want you to really understand. It's the most important thing if you're going to take this song, and if you don't understand one other thing, it's the word Corbunis. So fire, of course, is a sort of Yinglish or, you know, Americanized Yiddish. Fire is a different, there are many words in this. Pay, you're going to hear words like factory, the Weist factory. This song was written specifically, all the lyrics, after the fire, about the fire.
Stunde hat geklappt, der Schab hat gestoppt in der größer Westfactory. Die Arbeiter sei gekriegen die Pay in geeilt sich hängen vor früh. Und Blitz moi weh, a Schreck, a Geschrei, a hellisches Feuer brecht aus. Finde überall Kimmen, verzweifelte Stimmen, a jeder viel früher raus. Feierleit klingen, Vinzenzen Flor springen, Mädelach verranzt in Verneut. Es krackt in Geheir, das schreckliche Feuer, in verbrennt jinge Leib zum Tod. Werken das Ziel nun Rachmones, werken bewegen die Karbones, finden Feier dem geheimen Brand. Mames weinen, Tantes klagen, noch jinge Kinder kann ich suchen, weidig Schmerz und Scham, Karbones bin Dollarland.
When the fire began, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, a United Press reporter happened to be walking by Washington Square. He saw the fire, and he immediately got to a telephone and phoned in this report. I was walking through Washington Square when a puff of smoke issuing from the factory building caught my eye. I reached the building before the alarm was turned in. I saw every feature of the tragedy visible from outside the building. I learned a new sound, a more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding, living body on a stone sidewalk. Thud, dead, thud, dead, thud, dead. 62 thud deads. I call them that because the sound and the thought of death came to me each time at the same instant. There was plenty of chance to watch them as they came down. The height was 80 feet. I watched one girl falling, waving her arms, trying to keep her body upright until the very instant she struck the sidewalk. She was trying to balance herself. Then came the thud. Then a silent, unmoving pile of clothing and twisted, broken limbs. Call the firemen, they screamed, scores of them. Get a ladder, cried others. They were all as alive and whole and sound as we were who stood on the sidewalk. Sirens sounded from several directions. Here they come, we yelled. Don't jump. Stay there. One girl climbed onto the window sash. Those behind her tried to hold her back. Then she dropped into space. Then came that thud. I looked up. Another girl was climbing onto the windowsill. Others were crowding behind her. She dropped. I watched her fall, and again the dreadful sound. 2 windows away, 2 girls were climbing onto the sill. They were fighting each other and crowding for air. Behind them, I saw many screaming heads. They fell almost together, but I heard 2 distinct thuds. Then the flames burst out through the windows on the floor below them and curled up into their faces. The firemen began to raise a ladder. Others took out a life net. While they were rushing to the sidewalk with it, 2 more girls shot down. The firemen held it under them. The bodies broke through it. The grotesque simile of a dog jumping through a hoop struck me. Before they could move the net, another girl's body flashed through it. The thuds were just as loud. It seemed as if there had been no net there. It seemed to me that the thuds were so loud that they might have been heard all over the city. As I looked up, I saw a love affair in the midst of all the horror. A young man helped a girl to the windowsill. Those of us who were looking saw her put her arms about him and kiss him. Then he held her out into space and dropped her. But quick as a flash, he was on the windowsill himself. His coat fluttered upward. The air filled his trouser legs. I could see that he wore tan shoes and hose. His hat remained on his head. Thud, dead. Thud, dead. Together they went into eternity. I saw his face before they covered it. You could see in it that he was a real man. He had done his best. We found out later that in the room in which he stood, many girls were being burned to death by the flames and were screaming in an inferno of flame and heat. He chose the easiest way and was brave enough to even help the girl he loved to a quicker death after she had given him a goodbye kiss. Firemen raised the longest ladder. It reached only to the 6th floor. I saw the last girl jump at it and miss it. And then the faces disappeared from the window, but now the crowd was enormous, though. All this had occurred in less than 7 minutes. The start of the fire and the thuds and the deaths. I heard screams around the corner and hurried there. What I'd seen before was not so terrible as what followed. Up in the 9th floor, girls were burning to death before our very eyes. They were jammed in the windows. No one was lucky enough to be able to jump, it seemed. I looked upon the heap of dead bodies, and I remembered these girls were the shirtwaist makers. I remembered their great strike of last year in which these same girls had demanded more sanitary conditions and more safety precautions in the shops. These dead bodies were the answer.
What happened following the Triangle Fire changed the American workplace in profound ways. Immediately following the fire, families had to identify their relatives at the morgue. There were funerals each day as mourning families buried their victims, expressing their grief in the churches and synagogues all over the East Side. Then there was mass outrage. Who was guilty of killing all these workers? Was it the buildings department with its lax enforcement of safety laws and susceptibility to corruption? Was it the greedy owners, Blank and Harris, who locked the door so the women couldn't escape the flames? The anger and frustration was palpable among workers and citizens alike. To defuse the outrage boiling up in the community, the Women's Trade Union League called a meeting on April 2nd, 1911, at the Metropolitan Opera House. That night, an audience of 3,500 people crowded the auditorium. The progressives and the clergy advocated for the creation of a Bureau of Fire Prevention and to send a resolution to the state legislature asking for new laws guaranteeing greater protection for workers. But the socialist laborers in the balconies shouted them down in anger. As the meeting became unruly and chaotic, a petite 29-year-old former garment worker and WTUL organizer named Rose Schneiderman stood up to speak.
This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Every week, I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap, and property is so sacred. There are so many of us for one job. It matters little if 140 odd are burned to death. I can't talk good fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from experience it is up to the working people to save themselves, and the only way is through a strong working class movement.
I'm honored to be speaking in the same space in which Abraham Lincoln gave his stunning 1860 oration that ultimately led him to the presidency. And Clara Lemlich made her impassioned plea to inspire an historic strike of shirtwaist makers almost 50 years later and about 20 minutes ago. I cannot lay claim to the eloquence of Lincoln or Lemlich. The words that I have for you tonight are not my own, but rather those of another American hero with deep ties to the labor movement, Swedish immigrant Joe Hill. Joe Hill was a troubadour, a poet and songwriter for the industrial workers of the world, the radical union dedicated to organizing all workers in all industries, otherwise known as the Wobblies. He was an incredible humorist and wordsmith. If you haven't heard of him, you may have felt his legacy. If, for example, you've ever used an expression like pie in the sky, which he coined in a song called The Preacher and the Slave. 4 years after the Triangle Fire in 1915, Joe Hill was executed by a firing squad for allegedly murdering a businessman in Utah, a crime he most likely did not commit. Right before his execution, Hill sent a telegram to friends with the famous exhortation, "Don't mourn, organize." He didn't want people to be so full of grief and sadness at his death that they let the fight go out of them.
It's Joe Hill's last will. My will ain't easy to decide, for I have nothing left to hide. My kin don't need to fuss or moan, 'cause grass don't cling to a rolling stone. My body, if I could choose, I would to ashes reduce, and blow my dust to where it grows, to where some field of flowers are sowed. Perhaps some fading flower would then cling back to life and bloom again. This is my last, my final will. Goodbye, good luck to all of you. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and town where workers strike and organize, say you'll find Joe Hill Joe Hill. Joe Hill ain't dead, he said to me. Joe and Hill ain't never died. In Madison, they strike for rights, and Joe is at their side. And Joe is at their side. Now everybody, you ready? I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Said I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. Joe Hill, he lives. Joe Hill, he lives. Joe Hill ain't dead.
Like pie in the sky, the expression "don't mourn, organize" has been incorporated into the language of labor. But with all due respect to Joe Hill, the Triangle Centennial suggests that we might tweak his phrase. In effect, our motto for today, and indeed for the weeks and months leading up to today, has been mourn and organize. Today we mourn the loss of 146 people to greed, insensitivity, and lack of respect for human life and dignity, especially that of working women. But we are not immobilized by our grief and sadness. Tonight, we move forward to organize. We summon our righteous anger, strength, solidarity, and resources into the project of making a world in which accidents such as Triangle are unthinkable, simply do not happen. On behalf of the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, I urge you to join us as we organize for our next endeavor, the creation of a permanent public art memorial for the Triangle Fire. You may ask, why a memorial? The world is full of memorials to warriors and statesmen, erected mostly by powerful entities. We want to create something that allows ordinary people like us to speak for ourselves, to tell our own story. Something that honors the 146 people who died from the fire in a powerful way, that dignifies all the hard work that women do, work that is so often invisible and unappreciated, that remembers the movement for social justice stirred by this terrible tragedy, that inspires future generations of activists to take our place when we are gone.
To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness.
The backs, the yoke,
The yardage,
lapped seams, the nearly invisible stitches along the collar, turned in sweatshops by Koreans or Malaysians, gossiping over tea and noodles on their break.
or talking money or politics, while one fitted this arm piece with its overseam to the band of cuff I button at my wrist.
The presser, the cutter,
The ringer,
the mangle, the needle,
the union,
the treadle, the bobbin,
the code, the buttonholes,
the sizing,
the facing, the characters printed in black on neckband and tail,
the shape, the label,
the labor,
the color,
the shade,
the shape, the label,
the labor,
the color,
the shade,
the shape, the label, the labor, the color, the shade, the shape, the label, the labor, the color, the shade, the shape, the label, the labor, the color, the shade, the shape, the label, the labor, the color, the shade.
The shirt.
And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite success
succession of presents. And to live now, as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is in itself a marvelous victory.
Close your eyes for just 1 second, and as you remember the victims of the fire, just also feel the spirits of this room. From Abraham Lincoln, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and of course, Clara Lemlich, who on this very stage, just a little more than 100 years ago, sparked the biggest women's strike in US history to that time. She decided to be impatient, and she was followed by 20,000, probably a whole lot more, who threw their hats in the air, took the Union oath, and marched out of this room to sustain a strike through the cold winter of 1909-1910. That strike spread. It spread from New York to Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, Kalamazoo, Michigan, came back to Brooklyn, New York, where there was an even bigger strike of underwear makers, white goods workers. And it was those strikes, that uprising of teenage girls, before and after the fire, that gave us the labor protections that serve us all to this day. Here with us, Clara Lemlich's daughter, Rita Margulies. We're honored to have her.
So representing the women of the south of Italy who came here at that time of the fire, we're gonna do these songs that were part of their tradition of the peasants who left the south of Italy looking for a better future for the American dream, il sogno americano. This song is called Femmine. Femmine means women, women. And it's a song about the exploitation of the women who picked tobacco in the fields of Puglia. And that also was the part of their depression that caused them to dance the healing trance dance of the tarantella. Femmine, femmine, casciata aiuta tabacco. Ne sciati due e ne tornati quattro. Ne sciati due e ne tornati quattro.
On December 7th, 1907, the Fairmont mine at Monongah, West Virginia, blew up, creating a raging fire that destroyed the lives of at least 391 men and boys. 170 Italians died, including 6 trios of brothers. Entombed with the Italians were 85 Americans, 52 Hungarians, 31 Russians, 15 Austrians, and 5 men listed on the death records as Turkish subjects. Many of the bodies disintegrated in the explosion, but crews still pulled out so many corpses that the undertakers in the area ran out of coffins. Newspapers across the country headlined the grim story from the Monongah mines, the worst disaster in American industrial history. But no change came to the West Virginia mine safety laws.
Last year, 48 coal miners died in the nation's coal mines. 29 miners died instantly at the Upper Big Branch mine, owned by Massey Energy. There is an opportunity that has been presented to us, and we must seize that opportunity. I believe this governor in Wisconsin may go down as the greatest organizer that we have seen in our lifetime. Eleanor Roosevelt went down in a coal mine. By the way, I happen to think she was the greatest first lady we've ever had. But in the 30s, she went down in a coal mine. And she came up out of that coal mine. And that time, workers were being killed by the hundreds and the thousands in these mines. And they asked her, "What do you do, Madam First Lady, to protect coal miners?" And this is what she said: "There are two ways to protect protect workers in this country. One is legislation, the other is unionization. And I just want to stand up for the public employees for a moment, if I might. Let me tell you something. Coal miners stand in solidarity with our public workers. We stand shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm, back to back with you. Now this business that I'm hearing all across this country, well, everything's on the table. Well, that's a lie. Because I'll tell you what's not on the table, and that's the millionaires and the billionaires tax cut.
In 2005, I was approached by a group of Latino workers who told me that they were being locked in supermarkets like Bravo and Met Foods. And yes, I hope you don't shop there. To my surprise, as an idealistic lawyer, I thought, surely there has to be laws that prohibit this. Didn't we have the Triangle Fire? This was in 2005. I combed the law books, and to my surprise, yes, there were laws about safeties and doors and building codes, but can you believe it? There was not a law that prohibited employers from locking in workers overnight. They called it loss prevention. Loss prevention for not the workers, not for the people, for their inventory. Thankfully, through a coalition of Fifth Avenue Committee and the retail workers, we agitated for a bill that passed by council member at the time, Yaski, who is now actually, interesting enough, the commissioner of the Taxi Limousine Commission, and that in 2005 prohibited locking in workers overnight. It was a great victory, and this is the kind of engagement and the kind of agitation that we need to continue as we move forward and as we're remembering and rethinking Triangle Fire.
And I drove taxi cab myself for 16 years in this city. In 2004, I became a big-time victim. Some of you can remember, my face came the front page of most of the largest newspaper in New York City, ethnic New York, the newspaper. I had been stabbed by a passenger while I was driving with him. He was in my back seat and stabbed me with a hunting knife in my back. Went 6 inches into my body. It jacked in my back for a few hours. It didn't hit my aorta, my spinal cord, lung, and heart, just for half inch. They rushed me to the Bellevue Hospital with a delicate surgery. I got my life back. And then, with a big press conference, I urged the safety of my fellow workers. We asked that when you ride in a bus or the train, I think you have seen the stickers say, assaulting a bus driver or a transit employee is a felony, jail time up to 7 years. So we just asked simply a sticker inside the cab that we can educate the public that assaulting a taxi driver is a felony or it's a big-time crime. The driver got slashed the throat, assaulting every day. And Shamtali also mentioned one guy the last year who just slashed his throat and stabbed because he's a Muslim and he observed Ramadan. So lots of different ways cab drivers are being assaulted each and every day. I can tell you the truth. I was the person who drove 16 years. So one of the assembly member from Jackson Heights, Queens area, he introduced a bill to Albany that assaulting a taxi driver is a felony or crime, is a punishable crime. So jail time up to 25 years. So Assembly passed this bill 141 by 1, and the Senate passed 60 by 0. Unfortunately, the Governor Pattison didn't sign this bill. So please, if you heard anything like in the Albany, they're passing this legislation, I'm gonna asking to you guys, just please support the taxi drivers' bills of right as a just a sticker we are asking for that assaulting a taxi driver is a crime.
Americans tend to think of Chinese workers as them, those foreign workers who are stealing our jobs. Let's try to unpack that. It is true that workers in China struggle to survive. Wages are low, so low that workers feel they have to work overtime to make ends meet. In the vast export zones where American and foreign companies set up factories, workers work 14, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're lucky to get 1 day off a month. You may have heard about the 13 young workers who committed suicide at the Foxconn electronics plant by jumping to their deaths. They made iPhones and iPads for Apple. It is widely believed that the workers were so tired and stressed from working long hours that they jumped to their death in desperation. So after that, labor rights groups put pressure on Apple to put pressure on Foxconn to raise wages and reduce hours. You may have heard that health and safety conditions are appalling. And I can tell you that in my research in China, there are cities with hospitals filled with injured workers, with outpatient clinics on the first floor, recuperating workers on the middle floors, and those who will never go home on the top floors. And you may have heard that the government jails workers who disturb the peace, and this is true too. It is not true that Chinese workers are powerless to change their conditions. Walmart, Apple, Foxconn, and all the bad guys better watch out. Because last year in China, there were hundreds of strikes of workers that were 1,000 workers or more in number. One took place at a Toyota plant near Canton, where 1,200 workers went on strike for higher wages. In this strike, they practiced 3 refusals. One was the refusal to work for 3 days. The second was the refusal to elect leaders. And the third was the refusal to put forward any demands. This went on for 3 days because the workers knew that with just-in-time production, a production system where there's no inventory kept, a strike at their parts plant could cripple the Toyota system in China after 3 days of strike. So they did that to cripple the system, and they refused to have leaders or bargaining so that the employer could not pick off the leaders and pit them against each other. They were smart and strategic, and in the end negotiated a 30% increase in wages. Chinese workers are now interested in knowing more about collective bargaining from American and other trade unionists. Understanding that Chinese workers are just like us, that they want a better life and they're fighting for it. When we understand that, we begin to redefine us and them. They are not them, we are one. And when we understand that, we can come together not as big brother to little sister, but as equals to fight a common fight. When I was a garment worker here in New York City in the 1970s and 80s, the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers, the union that the survivors of the Triangle Fire built, had brought workers out of poverty. We had medical benefits and pension benefits. We sang in the union chorus. Some of you may have heard our commercials on TV. And we vacationed at Unity House, the union's resort in the Poconos. Occasionally, we had to fight to keep what we had, like the big strike in New York Chinatown in 1982, with almost 20,000 workers who fought to keep their union contract. But usually we felt pretty lucky. We bought houses and cars, our kids went to college. We thought we had bread and roses. Today, not much is left of my old local union, Local 2325, which, by the way, was the same local as Clara Lemlich. The industry has gone global, but unions need to go global too. We need strategies and linkages that bring workers in China together with Bangladesh and everywhere else to fight exploitation and injustice wherever it is, and fight for bread and roses for all.
And the poem goes like this. What can they do to you? Whatever they want. They can set you up. They can bust you. They can break your fingers. They can burn your brain with electricity, blur you with drugs till you can't walk, can't remember. They can take your child, wall up your lover. They can do anything you can't blame them for doing. How can you stop them? Alone, you can fight. You can refuse. You can take revenge. You can. But they will roll over you. But two people fighting, back to back, can cut through a mob. A snake dancing file can break a cordon. An army can meet an army. Two people can keep each other sane, give you support, conviction, love, massage, hope, sex. Three people are a delegation, a committee, a wedge. With four, you can play bridge, start an organization. With six, you can rent a house, eat pie for dinner with no seconds, and hold a fundraising party. A dozen makes a demonstration, 100 fill a hall, 1,000 have solidarity and your own newsletter. 10,000, power and your own paper. 100,000, your own media. 10 million, your own country. And it goes on, one at a time. It starts when you care to act. It starts when you do it again after they say no. It starts when you say we and you know who you mean. And each day you mean one more. Thank you.
Don't listen to their lies. Poor folk haven't got a chance unless we organize. Tell me, which side are you on? I wanna know, which side are you on? I wanna know, which side are you on? Tell me, which side are you on? Look at you sitting there, which side are you on? You should be standing, which side are you? You should be standing, which side are you on? You should be demanding, you should be demanding, which side bosses and killed by capitalism. Solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the Imperial Foods poultry plant in North Carolina in 1993 in the home of the beautiful jazz musician John Coltrane in Hamlet, North Carolina. Solidarity with the 60 women who turned down beds and emptied out bathroom toilet water at Grand Casino on the Gulf Coast after Katrina, who were buried alive. They were from Jamaica. You can stand in black skin and be in solidarity with the women who flew out the window to their deaths in 1911 in New York City. You can stand in solidarity with women who work in catfish plants in the Mississippi Delta.